The generals burned maps, but she drew roads in memory, the map that disappeared overnight. The first map she ever knew was not made of paper. It was the rhythm of footsteps down her village street, the smell of bread that always came from one direction, the tall oak tree that marked the boundary between safety and uncertainty. Her world had been small but clear, a series of landmarks that told her where she belonged. Then one night it all disappeared. Maps burned not only in fire, but in the way familiar places became strange. Roads she had walked since childhood suddenly led to danger. Paths she trusted ended in silence. The generals might have ordered the maps destroyed, but to her it felt as though someone had erased the lines inside her own mind. She remembered the morning after. Men with orders she could not read marched through the square, pointing to invisible boundaries drawn with words she did not understand. The bakery that had always opened its doors at dawn was shuttered. The oak tree still stood, but beneath it strangers loitered with rifles slung casually across their shoulders. Nothing about the landscape had changed, and yet everything had. It was as if the earth itself had shifted while she slept, stealing the certainty of where she could walk, where she could linger, where she could breathe. Her mother told her not to ask questions. Her father did not return that night, nor the next. Whispers replaced directions. People no longer said go to the mill or cross by the river. They said nothing at all, for fear that words might betray them. Without maps, without names, the world shrank into silence. She felt it pressing in, as though invisible walls had risen around her, suffocating and unseen. At first, she thought she could draw her own map. She tried to remember every turn, every field, every corner of the village. But fear made memory slippery. The sound of boots behind her erased details. The hunger in her stomach blurred lines. She realized then that maps are not only made of roads and borders, they are made of safety, of belonging, of trust. And those had all been burned away. The absence of a map changed her body. She walked differently, slower, with hesitation in every step. She watched shadows more than landmarks. She listened more than she looked. Her world was no longer something she could trace with her eyes, but something she had to feel with her skin, her pulse, her breath. Every choice of direction was a risk. Every step was an act of faith. Yet in that disorientation, something new began to stir. She discovered that memory could be stronger than ink. She remembered the way her grandmother once walked, always pausing to listen before crossing a road. She remembered stories told by neighbors about hidden paths through fields. She remembered lullabies that spoke of stars guiding travelers. These fragments wove themselves into a different kind of map, not drawn on paper, not carried in pockets, but carried within her. The generals burned maps to erase people, to make them wander lost, to force them into obedience. But they underestimated the power of memory. Memory is harder to burn. Memory lingers in scars, in stories, in gestures, and she, though still a girl, began to carry memory like a compass. There was one night when she nearly gave up. She stood at a crossroads, unsure which way would lead her home. The air was heavy with smoke, the stars hidden. She felt panic rise in her throat, the terror of being lost, not only in place but in herself. Then she closed her eyes and listened. Somewhere far off, a dog barked in a rhythm she recognized. Somewhere closer, the river murmured its familiar song. She breathed deeply and followed the sound. Her feet carried her forward, and though she stumbled, though she feared, she arrived. That night she understood that memory could guide her even when sight failed. She began to draw roads in her mind, invisible but real. Not the kind the generals could control, but roads made of sensations. The smell of bread, the texture of earth under her shoes, the way silence grew heavier near certain houses. She drew roads of compassion too, remembering who had once offered her family food, who had whispered a kind word, who had shared a scrap of news. These became her landmarks, more trustworthy than any official border. The map that disappeared overnight had left her frightened, unmoored. But as days turned into months, she realized that the absence of maps had forced her to draw new ones, ones that belonged to her alone. She carried them in her memory, fragile yet indestructible, secret yet unstealable. They were not perfect, they could not always prevent loss, but they reminded her that she was not entirely powerless. And so, while generals burned paper and redrew borders with ink and arrogance, she stitched her own map in silence, a map of survival, of memory, of scars, a map that lived not in books or commands, but in her heart, a map that could not be burned because it was carved into her being. That was the night she stopped fearing the loss of maps, because she realized she had already begun to draw her own, and in those invisible roads she found the strength to continue. The map that disappeared overnight, the first map she ever knew, was not made of paper. It lived in her body, in the rhythm of footsteps that echoed down the village street, in the smell of bread that always rose from one direction, in the tall oak tree that marked the boundary between safety and uncertainty. Her world had been small, but clear, a set of landmarks that told her where she belonged and how far she could go. It was simple, ordinary, a world where directions were given with trust, where paths meant connection and not danger. She thought that maps were just pieces of paper used by officials and soldiers, things that had little to do with the daily life of a girl. And then, one night, it all disappeared. It was not only the physical maps that burned, though she would later hear that soldiers had set fire to piles of them, claiming that new borders would replace the old. It was the map inside her mind that dissolved, the one she had carried since childhood. Roads she had walked every day suddenly ended in checkpoints. Corners where neighbors once greeted her now became places of suspicion. The oak tree still stood, but beneath its branches loitered men with rifles, their eyes cold, their uniforms unfamiliar. The bakery that once smelled of warmth and safety was closed, its windows shattered. The path to the river felt haunted, as though the water itself had been silenced. Nothing about the earth had changed, and yet everything had. It was as though the world had been redrawn overnight, and she had not been told how to navigate it. She remembered her mother pulling her inside when she tried to step into the street, her voice trembling though her words were firm. She remembered neighbors whispering instead of speaking, pointing with their eyes instead of with their hands. Directions stopped being words like go left or go right, and became only gestures, hushed warnings, hurried silences. Her father did not return that night nor the next, and in his absence, the house itself seemed to lose shape. Rooms once filled with certainty now felt unfamiliar, as though even the walls could not be trusted. She realized with a shock that maps are not only made of ink on paper, they are also the invisible lines of belonging, of knowing who to trust, of knowing where safety lies. And when those lines are erased, the world collapses into confusion. At first, she thought she could fix it. She closed her eyes and tried to recall every turn, every stone on the path, every scent and sound. She believed that if she memorized them well enough, she could draw her own secret map inside her head, a map the soldiers could not steal. But fear blurred the details. Hunger pressed against her ribs and made her mind wander. The echo of boots behind her erased entire streets from memory, replacing them with nothing but dread. She discovered that a map without trust is just a series of meaningless lines. The absence of maps changed her body more than her mind. She no longer walked with the light steps of a child, but with the hesitant tread of someone who feared what lay ahead. She paused at every corner, listening for voices, watching for movement. Her eyes no longer searched for landmarks, they searched for threats. Her world shrank until it was measured not in distance, but in courage. To cross a street was no longer a simple act, but a test. To knock on a neighbor's door became a risk. Every step was heavier than it should have been. Yet in that disorientation, she found something unexpected. Memory began to grow sharper, not duller. She remembered the way her grandmother used to pause before crossing roads, closing her eyes as though listening for something deeper than sound. She remembered stories told by neighbors of hidden paths through fields, trails that avoided the main roads now watched by soldiers. She remembered lullabies that spoke of stars guiding travelers home, songs that had seemed like nothing more than poetry, but now felt like instructions whispered across generations. These fragments became the foundation of a new kind of map, one not drawn with ink, not carried in pockets, but carried in her bones. The generals burned maps because they believed that without them, people would lose their way, would stumble into submission. They underestimated memory. They underestimated women who had spent lifetimes holding maps inside their minds, not on paper. Farmers who knew each turn of the soil, mothers who could navigate darkness by the sound of their children's breathing, daughters who carried the rhythm of streets inside their feet. These were maps no fire could consume, and she, though still only a girl, began to realize that memory itself was a compass. One night she found herself standing at a crossroads. The smoke in the air stung her eyes. The stars were hidden behind clouds, and the streets were empty of voices. She felt panic grip her chest. She had walked this way countless times, but now she could not tell which road led home. Her breath quickened, her heart pounded. She thought she might collapse in fear. Then she stopped and closed her eyes. In the distance, faint but steady, a dog barked in a rhythm she recognized. Nearby, though unseen, the river murmured, its sound as familiar as her own heartbeat. She breathed slowly, listened more deeply, and began to walk. Her steps were unsure at first, but each one grew firmer until she arrived safely. That night she understood. Memory could guide her when sight could not. From then on, she drew roads not with pencils, but with sensations. The smell of bread, even faint, told her which direction was safe. The feel of earth beneath her shoes, soft or hard, told her how close she was to the river. The silence around certain houses warned her of danger. These became her landmarks, her compass points. And in her mind, slowly, a new map began to form. This map was fragile and imperfect. It could not prevent soldiers from marching into her world. It could not promise safety every time she stepped outside. But it gave her something the generals could not take: agency, a sense that she was not entirely lost, not entirely erased. Her memory, stitched together from fragments, became her resistance. She realized that maps are not only tools for directions, they are also stories. They tell people where they have been, where they belong, where they might go. When the generals burned maps, they tried to erase stories to make people forget who they were. But memory is stronger than fire. Her scars remembered even when paper did not. Her silence remembered. Her tears remembered. And in that remembering she began to redraw the world. The map that disappeared overnight had frightened her, had left her feeling small and powerless. But as days turned into weeks, she learned that the act of remembering, of refusing to let go of what was once known, was itself a way of drawing roads anew. Roads others could not see, but could still be walked. Roads carried not in ink, but in the body, in the spirit. So while the generals marched with their new borders, while flags replaced flags and orders replaced orders, she carried her own flag inside her, a flag of scars, of memory, of invisible maps that no one could burn. And with every hesitant step, with every breath taken in defiance, she walked those roads. She carried them for herself, for her family, for all who had lost their way. She was not a cartographer by choice, but by necessity. And in her memory, the maps lived on. Her first road was hunger. The first real road she had to follow after the maps were gone was not marked by signs or stones, not carved through fields or forests. It was hunger. Hunger became the direction of her days, pulling her forward with an urgency stronger than any compass. It began quietly, as an emptiness she thought she could endure, but soon it spread through her body, her mind, her family, until every choice they made was shaped by it. Hunger is a map of its own, though cruel and unforgiving, and she learned to walk its lines whether she wished to or not. She remembered the first night she went to bed without food. Her mother had torn the bread into impossibly thin slices, pretending that sharing meant there was enough. Her little brother ate his without question, licking his fingers as if the crumbs were precious jewels. She pretended to eat hers, slipping half to him when her mother was not looking. Her stomach ached, but the ache was less painful than watching his eyes grow wide with longing. That was when she understood that hunger was not only physical, it was moral. It demanded choices between one's own survival and another's comfort. It tested the boundaries of love. As days passed, hunger drew its map deeper. It told her where to go in the mornings, toward the bakery to see if any flour had arrived, toward the square to hear whispers of a ration, toward the riverbanks to search for wild herbs. It led her into places she had never entered before, the neighbor's garden when no one was watching, the dark corners of barns where rats scurried, the forbidden fields where gleaning was punished but necessary. Every path she took was measured against her stomach's cry, and every decision was a crossroad between fear and need. Hunger redrew the geography of the village. The houses with smoke rising from chimneys became landmarks of envy. The wells became gathering places not just for water, but for the exchange of desperate recipes, stories of how to make soup from almost nothing. She heard women talk about boiling weeds, about stretching a single potato into a meal for 5. These conversations were not written down, but they were maps too, passed from mouth to mouth, guiding families through the famine that war had brought. Her body became a witness to this cartography. Her cheeks hollowed, her dresses hung loose, her steps grew slower, but her eyes grew sharper. She noticed things she had never noticed before. Which fields held edible roots, which trees still bore fruit even when neglected, which families shared without question, and which guarded their stores fiercely. Hunger sharpened her memory and her instincts, carving a survivalist's map into her very being. There was a morning when she followed her mother into the woods. They walked quietly, baskets in hand, searching for mushrooms. Every step felt like a gamble, for some mushrooms could sustain them, while others could kill. Her mother's knowledge became their guide, and she realized then that women carried maps older than any paper. Maps of the earth, of soil and seed, of herbs that healed and herbs that harmed. Her mother's fingers traced leaves and stems with reverence, teaching her that hunger could be answered if one remembered how to read the world. But hunger was not always so kind. There were nights when no amount of searching yielded food. Nights when the only map she could follow was endurance, staying still, breathing slowly, waiting for morning. Hunger carved patience into her, though it was a cruel teacher. It taught her that survival was sometimes not about action, but about waiting, about believing that tomorrow might bring something different. She saw how hunger changed people. Neighbors who once greeted her with kindness now closed their doors quickly, hiding what little they had. Friends grew quiet, ashamed of their empty cupboards. She heard of thefts, of betrayals, of people who turned on one another when the ache grew unbearable. Hunger did not only guide roads to food, it also led to roads of desperation, of choices that left scars no one could see. Yet hunger also revealed another map, the map of generosity. She remembered the widow Marta, who had less than anyone but always shared. Once Marta placed half a loaf into her hands and said, "Take it, child, my stomach has learned to wait longer than yours." Those words, as much as the bread itself filled her, they became landmarks in her memory. Proof that even in famine, there were roads paved by kindness. Her first road was hunger, and she walked it not alone, but with countless others. Women carrying buckets heavier than their bodies, children clutching scraps as if they were treasures. Old men whispering prayers over bowls of watery broth. Together they traced invisible paths of survival, weaving through scarcity with determination. Each act of sharing, each whispered recipe, each stolen moment of relief became part of a collective map that the generals could never burn. As the months dragged on, she realized hunger was shaping her into something new. It was hollowing her body, but sharpening her spirit. It was teaching her that scarcity did not only destroy, it also forced creation. She learned to make stew from scraps, to sew patches upon patches, to stretch moments of joy until they filled entire evenings. Hunger had forced her to see abundance in what others ignored, the sweetness of a single apple, the miracle of warm water, the richness of laughter shared on empty stomachs. Years later, when peace returned and her table filled once more with bread and fruit, she never forgot those lessons. She saved crumbs. She cherished every slice. She taught her grandchildren that food is not only sustenance, but memory, that every loaf carries the echo of nights when there was none. Hunger had been her first road, cruel and relentless, but it had led her not only to survival, but to compassion. It had carved into her the knowledge that no one should ever walk that road alone. And so, though the generals burned maps and redrew borders, though they thought they could dictate where people walked and how they lived, hunger created its own geography, one carried in bodies and memories. Her first road was hunger, and she carried its map forever, not in her hands but in her heart. When borders were drawn across her skin, she used to believe that borders belonged to maps, lines sketched by men who sat in distant rooms, arguing over ink and territory. Borders, she thought, were abstractions, things that separated nations and languages, but not the rhythm of her own life. Then the war came, and she discovered that borders were not confined to paper. They could be carved into bodies, pressed into silence, and etched across her very skin. At first the borders were subtle. They appeared in the way soldiers' eyes lingered too long when she walked to fetch water. They appeared in the way her mother told her to cover herself more carefully, to lower her gaze, to move quickly and quietly. Her body, once simply her own, became terrain marked by invisible lines. Every step outside her home felt like crossing into occupied land, where her safety depended not on maps, but on the whims of those who believed themselves to be in control. She felt those borders tighten the first time she was stopped in the street. A soldier asked where she was going. It was a simple question, but it carried weight heavier than any weapon. The road she had walked freely yesterday now belonged to someone else. Her body froze as if it too had been occupied. She realized then that war draws borders not just between countries, but between breaths, between moments, between what you may say and what you must keep hidden. Her skin became a canvas of boundaries. The bruises that appeared when she stumbled while running from patrols, the cuts from carrying firewood too heavy for her thin arms, the trembling in her hands when she held ration cards as though they were passports into survival. Every mark was a reminder that her body was no longer her own landscape, but one controlled by forces outside of her. Yet as with maps, she began to draw her own roads within those borders. She learned which streets to avoid, which houses offered safety, which gestures of silence could protect her. She learned to carry herself in a way that said nothing, revealed nothing, gave nothing. Her silence became a shield, a line drawn across her lips. Her stillness became a barricade, a wall invisible but unbreachable. But sometimes the borders could not be avoided. There were nights when she lay awake, her body curled tightly, feeling the weight of the world pressing down. She thought of her body as a small country, invaded and overruled, its laws rewritten by fear. She thought of how even in sleep she could not escape, for her dreams too were occupied by the presence of soldiers, by the sound of boots, by the heavy silence of commands. Her mother once told her, "They can draw borders around us, but they cannot erase what we carry within." At the time she did not understand, but slowly she began to see. Though her skin bore marks, though her movements were restricted, her memory remained free. Inside her, no border could be enforced. Her thoughts traveled where soldiers could not follow. Her love stretched across boundaries they could not see. Her hope crossed lines they could not redraw. And so she began to live in two worlds at once. On the outside, her body obeyed borders, moved carefully, remained silent. On the inside, her spirit traveled freely, carrying her beyond checkpoints, beyond walls, beyond fear. She discovered that even when borders are drawn across skin, memory can still cross them, compassion can still cross them, resilience can still cross them. There was one evening she would never forget. She was walking home when a soldier stopped her and ordered her to turn back. The road ahead, he said, was forbidden. She felt panic rise in her chest, but then she remembered another path, longer, hidden, winding through fields. Her feet carried her along that invisible road, her body trembling but moving. She realized then that while they could draw borders on her skin, she could still draw roads in her memory, roads that belonged to her, not to them. Years later, when she traced the faint scars on her arms, she did not see them only as wounds. She saw them as borders once forced upon her, but also as proof that she had lived through them. Each mark was a reminder that though her body had been treated as land to be conquered, her soul had remained unconquered. She had carried her scars not as chains, but as quiet flags, invisible to others, but undeniable to herself. She told her grandchildren, "There are borders you will see on maps, and there are borders you will feel on your skin. Do not let either of them define where your spirit can go." They listened with wide eyes, not yet fully understanding, but she hoped that one day they would, for she knew that the scars she carried were not only hers, they were maps for those who came after, reminders that borders may confine bodies but cannot confine memory. And so, even as generals burned maps and redrew lines on paper, she lived with the knowledge that the most powerful borders are invisible, drawn across lives, across bodies, across silence. But she also lived with the truth that those borders are not absolute. Roads exist within them, roads carved in memory, roads drawn by courage. And though her skin bore scars that would never fade, those scars were not prisons. They were the lines of a new map, one she carried within, one no one could take away. The road of silence. She walked barefoot. Silence had always been part of her life, but before the war it was gentle. It lived in the pauses between her mother's words, in the hush of twilight when lamps were lit, in the quiet hum of her grandmother's lullabies. Silence was rest, comfort, the breath of the world between sounds. But when war came, silence changed. It became a weapon, a wall, a road she had to walk barefoot, each step cutting her skin, each pause heavy with unseen danger. She learned quickly that words could betray more than silence ever could. A careless comment in the street might be overheard. A whispered question might reach the wrong ears. Even names became dangerous, carrying weight they could not bear. And so she walked a new kind of road, one where lips stayed closed, where voices retreated, where truth lived only in the eyes. Silence became her path, and though it bruised her spirit, it kept her alive. Her mother was the first to teach her the rules of this road. "Do not ask," she whispered, "do not answer. Listen, but do not repeat." At first the girl thought it cruel, this denial of speech, but she soon understood. One evening a neighbor had spoken too freely, sharing news of hidden food. By morning he was gone, and no one dared mention his name. That was when she realized that silence was not absence. It was armor, it was survival. Walking the road of silence felt like walking barefoot over shards of glass. Every step required caution, every breath had to be measured. Even laughter was dangerous, for joy could draw attention as surely as dissent. She felt her body tighten each time her brother spoke too loudly, each time her own voice threatened to rise. She pressed her lips together so often that they cracked, But she endured, because endurance was safer than sound. Yet silence was not only fear. Within it, new languages blossomed. A glance from her mother told her when to hide. The squeeze of her brother's hand warned her of danger. Neighbors nodded subtly to show solidarity. Women shared scraps of food without speaking, passing them like secret offerings. Silence carried meaning deeper than words. And she began to understand that walking this road barefoot did not mean walking it alone. There were nights when silence was heavier than bombs. She remembered sitting in the cellar as explosions shook the earth, and yet the room was filled with absolute quiet. No one dared cry. No one dared pray aloud. No one dared even breathe too deeply. In that silence, she heard everything. The pounding of her heart, the trembling of her mother's hands, the unspoken terror that filled every corner. Silence pressed against her chest until she thought it might suffocate her. But when the bombs stopped, silence also protected them, for it meant they had not been found. Over time, silence became so familiar that she carried it even when she was alone. She stopped singing to herself, stopped humming as she worked, stopped speaking her thoughts aloud. It was as if her voice had been buried, a part of her she no longer remembered how to reach. At times, she feared she had lost it forever. She feared that when the war ended, if it ever ended, she would not know how to speak again. But deep inside, silence was not emptiness. It was a seed, waiting. She discovered that silence had layers. There was the silence of fear, sharp and suffocating. The silence of grief, heavy and endless. The silence of waiting, stretched so thin it almost tore. But there was also the silence of strength, the silence that refused to give enemies the satisfaction of cries, the silence that honored the dead with dignity, the silence that held words too sacred to be spoken aloud. She walked all these silences, barefoot, learning the texture of each one. One day her little brother asked her why no one spoke anymore. She looked at him and answered only with her eyes. He frowned, but then he pressed his finger to his lips and nodded. Even he had begun to learn. That moment broke her heart, for no child should carry such lessons, and yet it also filled her with pride. For in silence, he too had found a road he could walk, fragile but strong. Years later, when peace returned and voices filled the streets again, she struggled to join them. People shouted, sang, laughed, as though sound itself was a victory. She smiled, but her lips trembled, unused to forming words. She realized then that the road of silence never truly ends. Even when noise returns, silence remains inside, a map etched into memory. She told her grandchildren, "There are roads you will walk loudly, with songs and laughter, and there are roads you must walk silently, barefoot, cautious. Both are necessary. Both will shape you." They listened, perhaps confused, but she hoped the truth would linger. For silence, though painful, had taught her endurance more deeply than anything else. And so she carried silence as part of her, not as a wound, but as a path she had survived. She knew that while generals could burn maps and redraw borders, they could never erase the roads walked in silence. Those roads remained, invisible but eternal, carried in her scars, in her memory, in the quiet strength of her gaze. Walking the road of silence barefoot had cut her deeply, but it had also kept her alive. And in the end, those cuts healed into maps no one could destroy. She followed rivers that remembered names. When the generals burned maps and roads became traps of silence and hunger, she learned to trust what could not be erased. Paper was fragile, boundaries were lies, but rivers remained. Rivers carried more than water. They carried memory. They whispered names long after mouths no longer dared to speak them. And so she began to follow rivers, not only to survive, but to remember, because rivers remembered even when people forgot. The river near her village had been part of her childhood. She had played on its banks, skipped stones across its surface, dipped her feet in its cold embrace during summers. Back then it was only water, only play. But during the war it transformed. It became a guide, a compass, a witness. Its sound became a language. When she was lost, she listened for its murmur. When she was hungry, she searched its edges for roots and herbs. When silence pressed too heavy, she sat beside it and let its voice fill the spaces where words could not. She realized one day that the river carried more than the sound of water. It carried echoes of names. Her father's name, whispered in the way the current bent near the mill. Her friend's name, heard in the rush of water against the rocks where they had once laughed together. The names of those who had vanished seemed to live in its song, as if the river refused to let them be erased. Once as she knelt to wash torn clothes, she heard the river murmur like a lullaby. It reminded her of her grandmother's voice, low and steady, singing of stars and journeys. She paused, hands trembling, realizing that the water was holding not only her reflection but also her memory. She whispered aloud the names of those she missed, and though no one else heard, the river seemed to carry them, repeating them softly as it flowed away. That was when she understood. Rivers remember. During the darkest months, when food was scarce and voices were silenced, she followed the river to survive. It showed her where berries grew in hidden places. It led her to reeds she could boil for nourishment. It guided her feet in the night, its sound steadier than any path. And always it carried names, names she dared not speak in the open, but which she let slip into the water like secrets. Each time she did, she felt lighter, as if the river promised to keep them safe when she could not. She began to mark time by the river. She knew when it rose after heavy rains, when it froze in winter, when it carried blossoms in spring. It became her calendar, her clock, her confidant, and in those rhythms she found comfort. For though the world of men was chaos, the river remained faithful. It did not lie. It did not betray. It remembered. One evening she brought her brother to its banks. He was frightened, restless, asking questions she could not answer. She told him to listen. At first he only heard water, restless and endless, but then she whispered, "If you listen with your heart, you'll hear names. The river keeps them safe." His eyes widened, and for the first time in days, he smiled. From then on, he too trusted the river, whispering into it when the nights were too heavy. Years later, long after the soldiers had left and maps had been redrawn yet again, she still returned to the river. She brought her children, then her grandchildren, teaching them to listen. She told them, "This river remembers what people forget. It remembers voices, it remembers names, it remembers us." They laughed at first, thinking it was only a story, but in time they learned too. For in its steady song, they felt the weight of history carried gently without erasure. The generals had burned maps to erase paths, to control memory, to dictate belonging. But rivers cannot be burned. They flow beyond control, carving their own borders, creating their own maps. And for her, this river became more than survival. It became proof that memory cannot be silenced forever. Proof that the names of those who vanished could still be carried, still be spoken, still be heard. When she grew older, her voice grew softer, but the river's voice remained. She would sit beside it, her hands resting on her knees, and whisper, "Father, Mother, Marta, Sophia." The names slipped from her lips into the current, and she knew the river would carry them long after she was gone. Her scars might fade, her stories might be forgotten by those too busy to listen, but the river would keep remembering. And so she followed rivers all her life, not because they were the easiest roads, but because they were the truest. They never betrayed her. They never forgot her. They turned hunger into guidance, silence into song, grief into memory. And in the end, they drew maps stronger than any the generals ever held. She followed rivers that remembered names. And in those waters, she knew she was never truly lost. Her hands became compasses. Her hands had always been busy, long before the war turned them into tools of survival. They had braided her sister's hair, carried baskets of apples from the orchard, sewn loose buttons back onto her father's shirts. They had known the softness of fabric and the warmth of bread dough rising under her palms. But during the years when maps were burned and voices silenced, her hands changed. They stopped being only instruments of daily life. They became compasses. They pointed the way forward when her eyes saw only ruin, when her ears heard only silence, when her mind was too tired to imagine tomorrow. At first she did not notice the transformation. She only knew that she had no choice but to use her hands constantly. They fetched water from wells too far away, scrubbed laundry in rivers too cold, stitched scraps of cloth into something resembling blankets. They trembled with exhaustion but kept moving, because to stop was to surrender. Slowly, she began to realize that her hands seemed to know things her mind did not. They reached instinctively toward what would help her survive. They stretched toward possibility when her spirit wanted only to collapse. She remembered the first time her hands saved her. She had been carrying her brother across a field when she heard footsteps behind them. Fear froze her, clouding her thoughts. She could not decide which way to run, which path was safest, but her hands moved before she could think. They pulled him down into the tall grass, covering his mouth gently but firmly. They held him still until the footsteps faded into silence. Only then did she realize what her hands had done. They had chosen safety when her mind was paralyzed by fear. From that day, she began to trust them. Her hands learned the language of survival. They knew how to measure flour so thinly that it lasted days longer than expected. They knew how to patch torn shoes with bits of wire and cloth. They knew how to cradle a crying child so tenderly that the child calmed even when hunger gnawed at both their stomachs. Her hands became maps of their own, each callus and scar a landmark pointing toward resilience. She began to notice how other women's hands carried the same quiet wisdom. Marta's hands, worn and cracked, still sewed with precision, turning scraps into garments. Sophia's hands, trembling from fatigue, still managed to cradle 3 children at once, each child resting as if those tired hands were the softest bed. Her mother's hands, once graceful, now bore the heaviness of endless work. Yet still they baked bread when there was barely enough flour to knead. These hands were not decorated with medals, not praised in speeches, but they were compasses guiding families through a world on fire. Her own hands grew older faster than the rest of her body. By the time she was barely a woman, they looked like her grandmother's, lined and calloused, the nails broken, the skin roughened. Sometimes she stared at them and wept, remembering the girl she had been, the one whose hands had known ribbons and ink instead of scars. But then she wiped her tears with those same hands, and she realized that though they had been changed by war, they had also been strengthened. They no longer trembled before hardship. They no longer hesitated. They pointed forward. One night, sitting by the river, she studied her hands in the moonlight. She traced each line with her finger, imagining them as roads. The scar near her thumb was the road of hunger, carved when she cut herself slicing roots too tough to chew. The callus on her palm was the road of silence, formed from carrying buckets through endless nights without a word. The faint burn mark across her wrist was the road of memory, from when she reached into fire to save a letter too precious to lose. Each mark told her where she had been. Together, they showed her where she was going. When her brother grew older, he once asked her how she always knew what to do. She laughed softly and held out her palms. "I don't always know here," she said, pointing to her head, "but I always know here." He frowned, not understanding, but then she placed his small hand inside hers, letting him feel the strength still pulsing through her tired fingers. "These hands remember paths," she whispered, "even when we forget." Years later, when peace returned, she still relied on her hands more than on any map. They planted seeds in soil once thought barren. They built tables from wood, salvaged from ruins. They taught her children how to cook, how to sew, how to hold others gently. Each lesson was a compass point, guiding them toward a future she had once feared impossible. Her hands never returned to their former softness. Even in old age, they bore the evidence of survival. But she no longer wept when she looked at them. She saw them for what they were, compasses carved by hardship, pointing not north or south but toward life. She told her grandchildren, "Your heart will sometimes mislead you. Your mind will sometimes falter, but your hands, if you let them, will carry you through." The generals had burned maps to control the world, to strip people of direction, to leave them wandering in fear. But they could not burn the maps carried in women's hands, hands that stitched, planted, held, comforted, hands that became compasses. Her own hands had guided her through silence, through hunger, through loss. And in the end, they guided her toward love, toward memory, toward survival. And so she carried them proudly, though they were rough, though they were scarred. For within her hands lived all the roads she had walked. And with every gesture, every touch, she drew new roads for those who came after her. Roads her grandchildren would follow, roads invisible but eternal. Her hands had become compasses, and they never stopped pointing the way forward. The invisible roads women built together. She often wondered how the world did not collapse entirely during those years. Roads were cut, maps were burned, borders shifted with every rumor, and yet somehow life continued. People still found ways to meet, to share, to comfort one another. It was only later that she realized why. While generals destroyed visible paths, women built invisible ones. Roads no one could trace on paper, roads carried in whispers, in gestures, in the silent rhythm of hands exchanging what could not be spoken aloud. At first she did not notice these roads forming. She only knew that when her mother sent her with a basket of bread, there would already be someone waiting who seemed to know she was coming. She only knew that when her neighbor Marta fell ill, herbs appeared by her bedside, though no one admitted to leaving them. She only knew that when silence grew too heavy in the square, one woman would begin humming and others would join, weaving a song that wrapped around them like a blanket. Slowly, she understood that these were not accidents. They were roads, invisible but sure, built by women together. The men were busy with orders, with uniforms, with battles they thought would decide the future. The women built another future quietly, with no medals, no speeches. They carried messages hidden in hems of dresses, traded food beneath the cover of silence, cared for one another's children when mothers could not. Each act was a thread, and together those threads formed a web of roads that stretched across villages, towns, and hearts. She remembered one night when hunger was at its worst. Her family had nothing left, not even crumbs. Her mother wept quietly, believing the children asleep. But before dawn, there was a knock at the door. No words were spoken, only a bundle left behind, potatoes, bread, a jar of milk. She never discovered who had left it, but she knew it was part of the invisible road. Someone had seen their need and answered it without seeking thanks. That unseen kindness became a path her family could walk, a reminder that they were not abandoned. Walking these roads required trust deeper than any map could provide. There were no signs, no guarantees, only faith that others were walking too, that hands would meet in the dark, that whispers would carry safely, that silence could be shared. And each time trust was honored, the roads grew stronger. They became lifelines, carrying hope across distances that would otherwise have swallowed them whole. She once asked Marta how she knew where to go, how she always seemed to arrive exactly when needed. Marta smiled and held her hand. "We listen differently," she said. "Men listen for commands, we listen for each other." That sentence stayed with her forever. It explained what she had felt but could not name. The roads were not built of stone or wood, but of listening, of seeing beyond words, of carrying each other's burdens without needing to announce it. There was danger, of course. The invisible roads were fragile, easily broken if someone betrayed them. There were women who were caught, punished, silenced forever. Each loss was a wound that threatened to tear the whole web apart. But even then, the roads did not vanish. Others stepped in, filling the gaps, carrying the weight, because survival was not an individual act. It was shared. She learned to walk these roads without fear of being lost. When she carried a bundle of herbs across the fields, she did not need directions. She trusted that the right door would open. When she sang a lullaby in the cellar, she knew the woman beside her would harmonize, turning grief into resilience. When she offered her last crust of bread to a neighbor, she trusted that someday, somewhere, someone would do the same for her. These invisible exchanges became the true geography of survival. Years later, when the war ended and men redrew borders yet again, she realized that the maps they celebrated meant little compared to the roads women had built together. The men claimed victory, but the women had carried life itself through the fire. Their invisible roads had held families together, had kept children alive, had preserved memory when all else was threatened. She knew this truth, even if no book would write it. When her grandchildren asked her how she survived, she did not tell them about the battles or the treaties. She told them about the basket of bread that appeared at her door, about martyrs' humming that turned silence into song, about the way women's hands reached for one another in the dark, steady and sure. She told them, "We built roads out of nothing, and we walked them together. That is why I am here." Her scars carried the memory of those roads. Invisible but undeniable, they stretched through her life like rivers under the surface. And though history forgot them, she remembered. For she knew that even when generals burned maps, women always drew new ones. Roads no fire could touch, roads carried in memory, roads built together in the quiet strength of survival. She drew roads for children with her voice. Children have always needed guidance, but in the years when paper maps were burned and spoken words could betray, the only roads they had left were the ones drawn for them by memory, by gesture, by song. She discovered this truth not because she wanted to, but because necessity demanded it. When the world around them had become unrecognizable, when familiar streets led only to ruins or soldiers, the children turned to her. They looked to her for assurance that they were not lost, for proof that there was still a way forward. And she gave it to them, not with maps in her hands, but with the sound of her voice. At first her voice was hesitant. She'd grown used to silence, to swallowing words, to walking barefoot on that dangerous road of quiet endurance. Speaking felt risky, singing felt impossible. But then she saw the fear in her little brother's eyes as the bombs echoed in the distance, saw how the younger children cried until their bodies shook, saw how they clung to her as though she could shield them from the collapse of the world. And in that moment, she remembered her grandmother's lullabies, songs that had once painted stars across the night sky. She opened her mouth, let the words fall softly, and immediately the trembling eased. Her voice was not strong, but it carried. It carried across the cellar where they huddled, across the fields where they waited in silence, across the narrow rooms where too many bodies pressed together for warmth. It carried like a thread, fragile yet unbreakable, stitching their fear into something gentler. She realized then that her voice could do what no map could. It could turn terror into direction, despair into hope, absence into presence. The children followed the roads her voice created. When she told stories of forests that could protect them, they imagined those forests even in the middle of ruins. When she sang of rivers that remembered names, they felt safe enough to whisper their own names into the dark. When she spoke of distant lands where peace still lived, their eyes grew brighter, as if they could see those lands just beyond the horizon. Her words became landmarks. Her songs became compasses. And though she carried no paper, the children never felt entirely lost. There was one night when the cellar was too crowded, air too thin, fear too sharp. A baby cried relentlessly, its wails cutting through the silence like blades. The mother was exhausted, her arms trembling, her eyes filled with helplessness. Without thinking, she reached for the child, cradled it against her chest and began to hum. Slowly, the cries softened. Slowly, the baby's breathing steadied. Slowly, the room itself seemed to breathe again. When she looked up, she saw the other children had closed their eyes too, leaning against each other, comforted not by safety, but by sound. Her voice had drawn a road for them all, a road leading out of fear, if only for a moment. She began to understand that drawing roads for children was not only about survival in the present, it was about teaching them to remember. She filled her stories with fragments of life before the war, the way fields smelled in spring, the taste of apples in autumn, the laughter of festivals in the square. These became markers in their memory, proof that the world had not always been rubble and silence. She told them again and again, so they would carry those images into adulthood, so they would know there had once been a different map and that it could exist again. Sometimes she invented stories of places they had never seen, lands without soldiers, skies without bombs, rivers that glowed with light instead of ash. The children listened wide-eyed, holding on to each word as if it were a promise. Perhaps the stories were not true, but they were necessary. For what is a map, if not a promise that there is a way forward? Her words became that promise, carried into the children's dreams. Years later, when peace returned and those children were grown, they still remembered her voice. One of them told her, "I would not have made it if not for the stories you told. They gave me a road when everything else was gone." She wept when she heard that, because she had never been sure her voice was enough. But it had been. Fragile though it was, it had held them steady. Her voice never returned to what it had been before. It always carried a tremor, a shadow of silence within it. But she no longer saw that as weakness. She saw it as proof that her voice had walked through fire and still spoken, proof that even when maps were burned, new roads could be drawn in air, carried in sound, etched in memory. She told her grandchildren, "Never underestimate your voice. It can be a weapon, a shield, a bridge, a road. Use it to guide, not to destroy. Use it to remember, not to erase." They listened, some laughing at the idea, but in their hearts they understood. For they had grown up on her songs too, though theirs were filled not with bombs, but with peace. The generals had tried to erase direction, to leave people wandering without paths, but they had not silenced her. They had not silenced the women who sang in cellars, who told stories in whispers, who drew invisible roads for children to follow. Those roads endured, carried in memory long after the war ended. And though no anthem would ever honor them, they were the truest songs of survival. She drew roads for children with her voice. And through those roads, the children found not only safety, but also the courage to believe in tomorrow. The roads that passed through ruins. Every war leaves behind ruins, but for her, they were not just broken buildings or piles of stone. They were landscapes she had to cross every day, landscapes that became part of her map of survival. The ruins were not only physical, they were emotional, spiritual, invisible. Each one marked a place where something had ended, where something had been lost, where a line had been burned across memory. And yet, she walked those ruins as if they were roads, for without them, she would never have reached tomorrow. The first ruin she learned to cross was the square where her father used to meet friends after work. She remembered it full of laughter, the clink of mugs, the smell of roasted chestnuts in winter. One morning she walked through and found only ash. The tavern had burned, the windows were shattered, the benches splintered. But the square was not empty. It was filled with absence. She felt it pressing against her chest. Walking there was like stepping through a ghost. And yet she crossed it, because she had to fetch water, because her family needed her. That was when she realized ruins were not barriers. They were roads, though painful ones. Each ruin became a waypoint. The collapsed church, where the bell lay cracked in the rubble, marked the halfway point to the river. The bombed-out school, its blackboard still standing amid the wreckage, marked the turn toward the fields. The burned bakery, where she once smelled bread every morning, marked the edge of the neighborhood where soldiers began to patrol. These ruins hurt her, reminded her of what had been stolen, but they also guided her steps. Memory and loss together became her compass. She discovered that ruins were not silent. They spoke. The school whispered the laughter of children, still echoing between broken walls. The church hummed with prayers left unfinished. The bakery carried the phantom smell of bread, sharp enough to make her mouth water, though it had long since turned to ash. Sometimes the voices of ruins comforted her, reminding her that life had once been whole. Sometimes they tormented her, reminding her of how much had been lost. But either way, she listened, because listening meant remembering, and remembering meant surviving. Walking through ruins also taught her resilience. Stones shifted under her feet, nails cut into her shoes, walls threatened to fall, and yet she learned to move carefully, steadily. She held her brother's hand tighter when glass glittered across the ground. She carried baskets balanced high so they would not catch on jagged edges. She became a traveler in a land of collapse, and every journey was a lesson in adaptation. There was one ruin she avoided for as long as she could, the house at the corner of the lane where her best friend had once lived. She knew it had been destroyed, but she could not bear to see it. One day necessity forced her there, and she stood in front of the rubble, her knees trembling. The walls were gone, the roof collapsed, the garden overgrown. But in the corner, under a piece of stone, she saw a small wooden toy. She picked it up, brushed away the dust, and felt her friend's presence again. She realized then that ruins did not only speak of endings, they also held fragments of memory waiting to be carried forward. She began to see ruins differently. They were not only signs of destruction, they were reminders of survival. If she could walk through them and still breathe, still move, still hope, then she was proving that life continued. Each time she crossed a ruin, she claimed it not for generals, not for soldiers, but for herself. She walked roads of rubble as if they were altars, honoring the past while refusing to be buried by it. Years later, when peace returned and people began rebuilding, she noticed something strange. Many tried to erase the ruins completely, to replace them with new walls, new streets, new houses, but she carried them in memory. She could walk the rebuilt town and still see the ghost of the old square, the echo of the cracked bell, the smell of bread from a bakery that no longer stood. The ruins had become part of her map forever. Even when stones were cleared away, she remembered. She told her children, "You must learn to walk through ruins. Not just the ruins of buildings, but the ruins of your own heart. Do not fear them. They are not ends, they are roads." They listened with wide eyes, uncertain, but she knew they would one day understand. For everyone, sooner or later, must walk roads that pass through ruins. And so she carried them, those broken places, those collapsed memories. She carried them as scars, as guides, as maps. The generals had tried to destroy her world, to leave her wandering without direction. But they did not understand. Ruins themselves become directions. They show you where you have been, they show you what has been lost, and they remind you that you are still moving forward. She walked the roads that passed through ruins, and though each step hurt, each step was also proof that she was alive. The night she carried the world without leaving home. There are nights that stretch longer than a lifetime, nights so heavy that they seem to hold the weight of the entire world. For her, one such night came without warning. She had not left her house all day. The streets outside were too dangerous, the silence too sharp, yet within the small walls of her home, she carried burdens larger than any battlefield. Without stepping outside, without walking even a single visible road, she carried the world. It began with the children. They were restless, hungry, frightened. Her little brother clung to her skirt, asking questions she could not answer. When will it end? When will we eat? When will father come home? She wanted to tell him the truth, but truth had become another casualty of war. Instead, she stroked his hair and whispered promises she prayed she could keep. Already her shoulders felt heavy, as though each promise added stones to her back. Then came the neighbors. A woman knocked softly, her eyes hollow, her baby crying in her arms. She asked for milk, bread, anything. There was almost nothing left in their kitchen, but still, she gave half of what they had. The child stopped crying, and for a moment the woman's face softened. But as the door closed, she felt the weight increase again. It was as though every cry she calmed, every hunger she eased, attached itself to her, demanding she carry it further. Her mother sat by the table, silent, her eyes staring into a space no one else could see. The silence was louder than any sound, heavier than any load. Her mother had carried so much for so long that now she seemed emptied, hollowed out by exhaustion. And so the girl, still young, still learning, took the weight onto herself. She prepared what little food they had, soothed the children, mended torn clothes by the dim light of a candle. Each action was small, ordinary. Yet together they felt immense, as if the fate of everything rested on her hands. Outside, the night was filled with distant thunder, but she knew it was not weather. Each explosion shook the walls, rattling the dishes, making the children cry anew. She wanted to collapse, to curl up and weep, but there was no space for that. She stood straighter, even as her knees trembled. She hushed the children again, sang softly, offered comfort with words she barely believed. In doing so, she carried them. She carried their fear, their hunger, their need. Hours passed, like years. The candle burned low, shadows stretched long. She walked from bed to bed, checking blankets, whispering reassurance, adjusting pillows stuffed with straw. Each time she moved, she felt heavier, as though the world itself was pressing down on her small frame, and yet she kept moving, because if she stopped, the fragile structure of their survival might collapse. At one point she sat by the window, staring at the darkness outside. She imagined the road she once walked, the square, the river, the ruins. She imagined people scattered across the land, each carrying their own unbearable loads. She realized she was not alone. All across the country, women like her were carrying the world without leaving home. Their hands held children, their backs bore hunger, their hearts carried silence. They were maps of endurance, each one drawing invisible roads that kept humanity alive. By dawn, her body ached with exhaustion. She had not slept, barely eaten, hardly spoken. And yet somehow, everyone else was still breathing, still alive, still held together by her quiet labor. She realized then that survival was not always about battles fought outside. Sometimes it was about battles fought within four walls, battles no one saw, battles where the weapon was love and the shield was endurance. Years later, when she remembered that night, she did not recall the explosions outside or the emptiness of their cupboards. She remembered the weight she carried, the way it almost broke her, and the way she endured. She remembered realizing that strength is not loud. It does not always march or shout. Sometimes it is quiet, invisible, carried in the silence of a home where one woman holds the world together. She told her grandchildren, "Do not think you must leave home to be strong. Sometimes the greatest strength is shown in the smallest rooms, in the quietest hours when no one is watching." They nodded, not fully grasping the truth, but she knew one day they would. The generals burned maps, redrew borders, declared victories, but she knew the real victories were won in kitchens and cellars, in rooms where women carried burdens too vast for words. That night, she carried the world without leaving home. And though no monument would honor it, she knew it had mattered. It had saved lives, it had saved tomorrow. Her memory was a cartographer. Long after the maps had been burned, long after borders were redrawn by men who never touched the soil they claimed, she discovered that memory had taken their place. Memory was not fragile like paper, not subject to fire, not erased by ink. Memory endured, carried silently in the body, in the mind, in the scars that refused to fade. Her memory became her cartographer, drawing maps the world could not see, maps that guided her when all else failed. It began with small things. She remembered the way the ground sloped near the riverbank, even when smoke covered the sky. She remembered the sound of dogs barking in rhythm, signaling the presence of strangers. She remembered which houses smelled of bread and which of fear, which doors opened quietly and which never opened at all. Each detail was a line, each recollection a landmark. Together they formed maps too intimate to be shared, too vital to be forgotten. She realized her memory did not only record places, it recorded feelings. The fear she felt on one road warned her never to walk it again. The comfort of a neighbor's smile told her which paths led to safety. Hunger etched itself into corners where food was once shared. Silence carved itself into streets where voices had been silenced forever. These emotions became part of her geography. Her memory mapped not only space, but experience, turning every sensation into direction. Sometimes memory betrayed her. She would walk past a ruin and recall the laughter that once filled it, the warmth that once lived there. The contrast between then and now was unbearable. She wept, wishing her memory would soften, wishing it would blur the edges. But even then she understood. Forgetting was another kind of death. If she forgot the laughter, it would be as if it had never existed. So she carried both, the joy and the grief, allowing her memory to mark them as coordinates on her inner map. Her mother once said, "We survive by remembering." At the time she thought survival meant food, shelter, quiet nights, but she came to understand that memory itself was nourishment. Without it, there would be no proof that life had ever been different, no reason to believe it could be again. Memory gave shape to hope. By remembering the taste of apples, she could believe orchards would one day bloom again. By remembering festivals, she could believe laughter would return to the square. Memory was not just a record of what had been lost. It was a compass pointing toward what could be rebuilt. She noticed how memory connected her to others. Women whispered stories not only to comfort their children, but to keep memory alive. Each story was a map shared, a way of saying, this is where we have been, and this is how we endured. These stories passed like torches, lighting invisible roads from one generation to the next. She realized then that memory was communal. Each person carried fragments, and together they formed a map larger than any individual. One night, she sat with Marta by the river. They spoke softly, recalling the names of neighbors who had vanished. Marta wept, asking what good it did to remember when nothing could bring them back. She placed her hand on Marta's and whispered, "Because if we forget, then they are gone twice. But if we remember, they walk with us still." The river carried their words, and she knew that in memory, the dead were never truly absent. They remained part of the map, guiding the living. As years passed, she began to see her memory as a deliberate act, not just an accident of the mind. She chose to remember. She practiced it like a ritual, whispering names in the dark, retelling stories by candlelight, tracing scars with her fingers as if they were lines on a map. Her memory became active, creative, shaping paths where none existed. She was her own cartographer, charting survival in places where others saw only ruin. When peace finally returned, people rushed to rebuild. New houses rose, new shops opened, new streets were named. The past was buried quickly, almost too quickly. She walked the fresh streets, but could still see the ghosts of the old ones. Where others saw only a clean square, she remembered the tavern burned to ash. Where they saw new gardens, she remembered graves without markers. Her memory layered itself over the rebuilt world, refusing to let it be erased. It made her an outsider at times, because she walked through two maps at once, the present and the remembered. But it also made her strong, because she carried truth within her that no one could deny. Her grandchildren once asked how she always knew where to go, even without signs. She smiled and said, "Because memory draws maps, even when no one else can see them." They laughed, thinking it was only a metaphor, but she knew it was literal. Her memory had been her guide through hunger, silence, ruins. It was still her guide, even in peace. She often thought about how the generals had believed themselves powerful when they burned maps. They thought they could erase history, control the future, leave people wandering in confusion. But they had not counted on memory. Memory drew new maps in every survivor, in every scar, in every lullaby and story whispered in the dark. The generals' maps turned to ash. The survivors' maps endured. Her memory was her cartographer. It drew the past so she would not lose herself. It drew the present so she could endure. And it drew the future, faint but steady, so her children and grandchildren would know there was always a way forward. The road's generals could not burn. The generals believed they had power over everything. They believed that when they set fire to maps, they erased directions, identities, belonging. They believed that when they drew new lines in ink, they could decide where people lived, where they walked, where they were allowed to breathe. But there were roads the generals could not burn. Roads that did not exist on paper. Roads that could not be destroyed by fire or redrawn by arrogance. Roads carved in memory, in silence, in scars, in love. She walked those roads every day, though no one else could see them. They stretched between her and her mother, between her and Marta, between her and the children she comforted in cellars. They were built of gestures, a hand reaching across darkness, a crust of bread divided, a song hummed so softly it might have been only breath. These were roads that carried more than bodies. They carried endurance. One of the roads the generals could not burn was the road of care. Women built it in kitchens and cellars, in gardens and ruins. Each act of care, tying a child's shoes, washing a neighbor's clothes, mending a torn sleeve, was a step upon that road. It had no signs, no soldiers, no checkpoints. It could not be patrolled because it was invisible, and yet it held the world together more securely than any road paved with stone. Another road the generals could not burn was the road of memory. It stretched backward, carrying the voices of the dead, and forward, carrying hope for the unborn. She walked it every time she whispered names into the river, every time she told a story to children who had never known peace. Memory was a road without borders. It could not be contained by fire. It lived wherever survivors carried it, multiplying with every retelling. There was also the road of silence. She had learned to walk it barefoot, painfully, but she came to see its strength. Silence linked her to others who endured. A nod, a glance, a shared stillness became a road as real as any highway. The generals thought silence meant obedience, but they misunderstood. Sometimes silence meant resistance. Sometimes silence meant survival. Sometimes silence meant we are still here. That road, too, could not be burned. Perhaps the strongest road of all was the road of love. She discovered it not in romance or grand declarations, but in the smallest gestures, the way her mother's hand lingered on her shoulder, steadying her, the way Marta sang, even when her voice trembled, the way children clung to her skirts, trusting she could protect them. Love wove itself into the fabric of every day, invisible yet unyielding. It created a road no fire could touch because it was written not on paper, but in the human heart. She remembered one night when soldiers marched through the village, setting fire to homes, the air filled with smoke, the streets with terror. And yet, amid the chaos, she saw a woman carry not her belongings, but another woman's child. She saw a man pass water to a stranger. She saw neighbors guiding each other through flames. In that moment, she understood. The roads that could not be burned were alive, carrying people forward even when everything around them collapsed. Years later, when she told her grandchildren about those days, she did not describe battles or generals. She described the invisible roads. The roads you cannot see are the ones that saved us, she told them. The ones drawn with kindness, with memory, with love. Those are the roads no fire can destroy. They listened, perhaps skeptical, but in their hearts they began to understand. For even in peace, such roads were necessary. The generals had burned maps to erase, but what they failed to see was that erasure itself created new maps. Each act of destruction forced survivors to draw roads within themselves, roads stronger than ink. Fire consumed paper, but it also revealed resilience. Each flame lit the truth, that real roads live in people, not in maps. She carried this truth with her all her life. Whenever she walked through rebuilt streets, she saw not only the new buildings, but the invisible roads beneath them. Roads of generosity, roads of endurance, roads of shared silence, roads of unspoken love. They were not honored with monuments, but they were the true foundations of survival. And so she knew with certainty that the generals had failed. They had burned maps, but the roads remained. They had tried to erase, but memory endured. They had drawn borders, but love crossed them. They had silenced voices, but silence itself became a language of survival. The roads they could not burn were the roads that carried her family, that carried the future. Her roads became bridges for others. She never set out to guide anyone. In the beginning, her only thought was survival. How to keep her brother fed, how to protect her mother from despair, how to carry herself through hunger and silence without collapsing. But roads have a way of expanding. Once drawn, they are not easily contained. Others began to walk the roads she carried inside her, and without realizing it, she became not just a survivor, but a bridge. It began with the children. They followed her voice, clung to her hands, trusted the calmness she forced into her expression, even when fear gnawed at her insides. Each time she told them a story or sang them to sleep, she was not only drawing roads for them, she was building bridges, carrying them across nights that would have swallowed them whole. They might never remember every word, but they carried the feeling that someone had guided them across the darkness. Then came the neighbors. Marta once whispered, "You always know where to go." She wanted to deny it, to insist she was just stumbling forward like everyone else. But she realized Marta was right. Her memory had become a compass, her scars had become maps, and others were following her unspoken directions. When she gave away the last of her bread, when she paused to help a woman lift water, when she whispered a warning to a friend, each act built a bridge. She was not only surviving, she was carrying others with her. The roads she walked turned into bridges because she refused to walk them alone. Each time she extended her hand, someone else crossed over. Each time she offered silence instead of betrayal, someone else was spared. Each time she remembered a name, that name lived on. She began to understand that survival was not solitary. It was shared. Bridges were what allowed them to cross from despair to endurance. There was one evening she would never forget. The sky was heavy with smoke, the streets too dangerous to walk. A mother stood frozen at the edge of the square, unable to move, her children crying at her side. Without thinking, she took the woman's hand and led her down an invisible road she had memorized, the one that wound behind the bakery ruins, through narrow alleys, to the safety of a cellar. The woman clutched her as though she were solid stone. That night she realized, sometimes the road you carry in memory becomes a bridge for someone else's survival. Her bridges were not always physical. Some were made of words or silence or presence. She became the one people sought when fear grew too large to bear alone. She would sit beside them, not speaking, simply listening. In that silence, they found a way across their grief. Her presence became a structure stronger than walls, a path leading them out of despair. She had not planned it, had not asked for it, but she carried them all the same. In time, she accepted that her life had become a bridge. Each scar was not only proof of her survival, but also a plank others stepped on. Each memory was not only hers, but also a torch, lighting the way for others. She sometimes felt the weight of it, the exhaustion of carrying so much, but she also saw the truth. Bridges are meant to bear weight. They are built not to stand alone, but to carry others across. Years later, in peace, she looked around at her family, children grown, grandchildren laughing, and realized how many had crossed on the bridges she built. They might never know it fully, might never see the invisible roads she once walked, but they were standing on the other side because of them. Her scars had become the foundation of their safety. Her silence had become the structure of their peace. Her memory had built the span that carried them here. She told her grandchildren, "Every step you take is on a bridge someone built for you. Remember that, and when your time comes, build bridges too." They looked at her with awe, perhaps not yet ready to understand, but she trusted that the lesson would live in them as surely as it had lived in her. The generals had burned maps to leave people lost, but she had drawn roads in memory, and those roads had become bridges. Bridges no fire could destroy, bridges no ink could erase, bridges carried in hands, in hearts, in voices, and though she never asked for it, she had become one of those bridges herself, spanning the distance between despair and survival, between ruin and future, between silence and life. Her roads had become bridges for others, and that, she realized, was the deepest purpose of her scars, not only to guide her, but to carry the world forward, one step at a time. The map hidden in her silence. All her life, silence had been both a burden and a shield. She had walked barefoot along its sharp edges, endured its weight when words became dangerous, and carried its heaviness in her chest even when peace returned. Yet, as the years passed, she realized that silence was not only an emptiness imposed by war, it was also a map hidden within her, invisible but guiding. Her silence contained roads no one else could see, roads that connected her past to her future, her grief to her endurance, her scars to her survival. She discovered this slowly, almost accidentally. When others asked about the war, she often remained silent, unable or unwilling to relive the memories. At first, she thought her silence was weakness. But then she noticed how others leaned into it, how they listened more closely in the pauses than in the words. Her silence carried meaning. It told them that some truths were too heavy for speech, that some experiences lived beyond language. The unspoken became a map, leading others to understanding without needing explanation. Her children learned to read this hidden map instinctively. They knew when her silence meant sorrow, when it meant warning, when it meant love too deep for words. A hand placed on the table, a look into the distance, the way she folded her apron, these became landmarks in her unspoken geography. They followed those signals as surely as if she had drawn them with ink. She realized that silence had guided her more than words ever could. In silence, she had hidden food for her brother. In silence, she had carried messages for neighbors. In silence, she had resisted soldiers who demanded answers. Silence had been her compass, her protection, her language. And though it had once wounded her, she now saw its shape more clearly. It was a map, precise and enduring, hidden where no general could ever burn it. There was one evening long after the war when her granddaughter asked her to tell a story of those years. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Instead, she closed her eyes, let the silence stretch. The girl grew restless at first, then quiet. In that silence, she felt the weight of what had been endured, more powerfully than any story could have conveyed. Finally, she whispered, "I understand." And the woman realized then that silence itself had drawn a road into the child's heart, carrying truth without sound. She remembered how silence had once been suffocating, a punishment imposed by fear. But now she saw it differently. Silence had become a container, holding memory safe, keeping it alive even when speech might have destroyed it. Silence had preserved names, preserved grief, preserved the dignity of those who could not defend themselves. It had been a vault, and inside it lived a map too sacred to show openly. Even in peace, she kept that map close. She spoke when she could, but often she chose not to. She let silence carry what words could not. She knew others sometimes misunderstood, mistaking her quiet for distance or detachment. But those who loved her learned the truth. Her silence was full of memory, full of roads, full of love. She told her children once, "There is a map inside me that I cannot give you in words. You will learn it only if you listen to what I do not say." And indeed they did. They watched how she lingered at certain ruins, how she touched river water before drinking, how she saved even crumbs of bread. These actions spoke louder than speech. They revealed the map hidden in her silence, a map etched not in sound, but in endurance. When she grew old, she feared her silence would die with her. But then she realized that those who had walked beside her already carried fragments of it within them. Every story unspoken had still been heard in some way. Every pause had still shaped those who listened. The map would not vanish. It had already been passed on, silently, invisibly, enduringly. The generals had burned maps to erase paths. But silence, she knew, contained roads no fire could touch. Silence was indestructible because it lived not in ink, but in memory, not in paper, but in breath. And though her silence would never be written down, it was real. It was the truest map she had ever drawn. Her silence was not emptiness, it was direction. It was a bridge between the unspeakable past and the fragile present. It was a guide for those who came after, teaching them that not all truths can be spoken, but all truths can be carried. In silence, she had survived. In silence, she had endured, and in silence she had left a map for others to follow, hidden but indestructible. The generals burned maps, but she drew roads in memory. In the end, when her hair had turned white and her hands shook not from fear but from age, she understood what the war had done to her and what it had left behind. The generals had indeed burned their maps. They had paraded themselves through villages, tearing down old borders and raising new flags as though paper and fire were stronger than memory. They believed they had erased direction, silenced belonging, fractured lives into confusion. But they had not seen her. They had not seen the women who refused to vanish into the ashes. They had not understood that even as their flames consumed ink, survivors were already drawing new roads, roads that lived inside them, roads that fire could not touch. She carried those roads all her life, roads of hunger, of silence, of ruins, of rivers, of songs, roads drawn by scars on her hands, by whispers in the night, by the smell of bread that no fire could erase from her memory. She carried them not in books, but in her body, in her spirit, in the way she walked even through peace. When her children asked how she always knew where to go, she smiled, but did not answer. How could she explain that every step she took was guided by invisible maps etched into her by endurance? How could she explain that memory itself was her cartographer? The final truth she learned was that roads drawn in memory become more than paths for survival. They become inheritance. She watched her grandchildren play in streets rebuilt, their laughter echoing where silence once reigned. She listened to their songs and realized they were roads too, carrying life forward. She saw them share bread without hesitation, help neighbors without question, and she recognized her own roads living in them. Her scars had become maps, her memory had become a compass, and now those maps had turned into bridges for others. The generals had burned paper, but she had drawn legacy. Sometimes she returned to the river. She would sit by its edge, whisper names into its current, and feel the road stretch backward and forward, backward, toward those who had vanished, forward, toward those yet to come. The river carried them all, proof that nothing is ever fully erased. She would close her eyes and hear the murmurs of those names blending with the sound of water. In that moment, she knew she had never been lost, no matter how many maps were destroyed. Her silence too carried roads. Even when she spoke less and less, her pauses guided those around her. They learned to listen, not only to her words, but to her quiet. In her silence, they discovered truths too deep for language. In her stillness, they felt directions stronger than any border. She saw them understand, slowly, that silence itself can be a map, one that points not outward but inward, into memory, into compassion, into survival. She often thought of Marta, of Sophia, of her mother, women whose maps had ended too soon, who had carried roads in their hands and hearts that the world would never fully see. She carried them with her, honoring them in every story, every gesture, every pause. Their roads did not end. They flowed into hers, invisible threads woven into her map. And now, through her, they flowed into her children, her grandchildren. Even death could not erase them. One evening, sitting by the fire, her grandson asked her what the war had taught her most. She took his hand, rough and young, and placed it over her own. "That fire can destroy paper," she whispered, "but not memory. That maps can vanish, but roads remain. That generals can burn, but women can draw." He nodded slowly, not yet grasping the fullness of it, but she knew one day he would. When she finally lay down for the last time, her body fragile, but her spirit unbroken, she felt the weight of all those roads within her. They stretched across her chest like threads of light, across her hands like rivers, across her silence like stars. She felt herself becoming part of them, not erased, but carried forward. She knew her memory would live in those she had guided, in the children she had sung to, in the neighbors she had helped, in the grandchildren who would carry her quiet lessons into the future. The generals had burned maps, but they had failed. They had believed destruction was the end, but destruction had only created resilience. They had believed silence was submission, but silence had become language. They had believed scars were weakness, but scars had become compasses. They had believed memory could be erased, but memory had become a cartographer. And so, as her breath slowed and her eyes closed, she did not see flames or ruins. She saw roads, roads stretching endlessly, roads built of scars and silence, rivers and songs, laughter and grief, roads that could never be burned because they were carved not on paper but in the human spirit, roads she had carried all her life, roads she was leaving behind for others. Her life had been a testament to survival, not the kind written in history books, but the kind etched quietly in kitchens, cellars, riversides, lullabies, scars. She had never held a map in her hands. She had never drawn borders with ink. But she had drawn roads in memory, and those roads had carried her family, her people, her future across the fire. The generals burned maps, but she drew roads in memory. And in the end, it was her roads that endured.